In this video, we're going to show the true power of Webflow in building a one-page responsive website in under 30 minutes. We're going to go ahead and get started by duplicating this website that we see here. We're going to start with a blank canvas. The only thing on this site right now is the body and the navigator panel. We're going to put all of our content inside of this, starting with our nav bar. When dragging in the nav bar into Webflow, it's going to default some nav links as well as provide a brand link block to put your logo in. The nav bar will also work on all of your different devices. Now, with many of the elements in Webflow, you're going to go through the process of adding them on the page and then adding classes to them in order to add styles. In this case, we've added the nav bar, but in order to style the nav bar, we need to first add a class. So in the style panel on the right-hand side, we're going to do just that. I'm going to click in the text field and add a class name. In this case, I'm going to call it navbar. Notice that now that I've added a class, I'm given the option to add a number of different styles to it. In this case, what I want to do is add some padding to both the top and the bottom. I also want this content or this navbar to be fixed to the top of the page. I'll do that by going to Position, Fixed, and then choosing to have it on the top of the page. I also want to adjust the fill color or the background color. In this case, I want it to be white with a slight opacity. Now, before I go any further with the nav bar, I want to add some context around it. So I'm going to add my hero section next. So again, in the add panel, I'm going to drag in a hero section or just a section element. The first thing I want to do is add a class to this element, which again, I'll navigate to the style panel and add my class name here. Now that I've added the class, I can now begin to add my styles. In this case, I want to add a height of 600 pixels, as well as upload a background image, which I already have ready for us. Once uploaded, you can further adjust your background image with these settings here. In this case, I want the image to cover the entire container that it's in. Now we have a better idea of our nav bar and how it affects the rest of the site. So let's go ahead and finish up there. I'm going to start by adding in my logo, which can be done by dragging in an image element into the brand link block. And then you can upload your logo file. Once uploaded, you can adjust the width or height to fit your needs. In this case, I'm going to use 280 pixels. Now that the logo's in there, only thing that's left is to adjust the nav links. Webflow will default 3 nav links for you, but there are no classes attributed to them. So the first thing we want to do is to click one and add a class. Now that the class has been added, we can adjust the styles. The first is the font color to be a light gray. And then to adjust the font size to be 15, and then to make all the letters uppercase. Now what we could do is simply add an additional class to each of these elements, and notice it'll copy over the same styles as the previous class. Now, because we need 4, all we need to do is simply click on one, and then use copy and paste on our keyboard. Another important thing to look at when you're using links is to add hover treatments. In order to do that, simply click on the link, and in the Styles panel, locate the States menu and select Hover. Once you do, any of the styles that you change here will only take effect when you hover over that element. In this case, what I want to happen is change the font color to pink. Notice now when we hover over each of these nav links, the font color changes to the pink. However, it happens pretty fast. Another thing that you'll do with links is add transitions. At the very bottom of the style panel, in the transitions section, we can add a transition for font color. The defaulted value is going to be 500 milliseconds, which is typically perfect. And notice now when you hover over the elements, there's a nice transition effect. Now all we need to do is update the content in the nav bar, which I'm going to fast forward through right now. Perfect. Now our nav bar is complete. The next thing we want to do is start adding in our hero section content. The first thing we want to do is drag in a container, which is going to hold all of our content elements in place. Notice now the container is moved up behind the nav bar, so what we want to do is add some padding to push that container down. So clicking on the hero section, we can adjust padding on the inside to push the nav bar a little bit further down to the middle of the hero section. Now we can begin to add our content within the container, starting with the heading. Below this heading, I want to add some additional text, so I'm going to drag in a text block. The text block, I'm going to also give a class to. In this case, I'm going to call it a hero subheading and begin to style it. I'm going to change the font color to be white, adjust the font weight, also adjust the font size, and the line height. I also want to adjust it so that the width is only 60% of the container that it's in. So I can type in 60%. Great, now below this, I want to add a button, which I'll do by simply dragging it onto the page. And I will drag it within the container. I've already added some styles to this button, but if we look over in the style panel, we can see what those are. The first thing I've done is added some padding inside of the button to give it some space. I've also changed the font color to be white, centered the content, added a fill color, which in this case is a pink with a slight opacity, as we can see here. And I've also added some borders around each of the sides of 3 pixels and a border radius, which is going to curve the corners of the button. There's also a transition effect to adjust when the background color is being hovered upon. So in this case, if I was to hover over the button, notice that the background color transitions from a pink with a slight opacity to a pink with a full opacity. I also want to add some space between my hero subheading and my button. To do that, I'll click on my hero subheading and add some margin below it. There we go. Now all I need to do is update my content inside of the hero section. There we go. So now we've completed our navbar and our hero section. The next section that we want to add is a 3-column layout section, which will start by adding in a section element. We'll drag it into the body, which will appear below the hero section. I'm also going to give this section a class. It's going to be the same class that all of my sections on the page will use. The common element or style that these sections will have will be some padding on the top and the bottom of 70 pixels. The next thing I want to do is add in my container, which is going to hold all of my content elements inside of it. The first thing I want to add is my heading. In this case, I want it to be in H2. Below this H2 is where my columns will live. Webflow makes it super easy to add columns by simply dragging in the columns element and then adjusting how many columns you'd like to have. In this case, we need 3. Now we can begin to add the content inside of these columns. The first thing I'm going to do is add a div block, which is going to hold all of my elements inside of it. Next, I'm going to drag in an image, then some heading text, in this case in H3, and lastly, some paragraph text. Now I want to begin to add some styles to these elements in order to look the way that I want. The first is the div block holding all of these elements together. I'm going to give it a class name of about block. Then I want to add some additional styles by centering the elements and then adjusting the padding on the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. To adjust padding on all sides, simply hold Shift on your keyboard and select one element and it will change on all of them. I also want to add an additional class to my image so that it can have a fixed width. I'm going to call this our about image and then add a fixed width of 100 pixels. Now I can begin to upload and edit my content. And begin to update all of my copy. Great, and now because we've wrapped all of this content into one div block, all we need to do is simply copy and paste into the remaining columns. Now, all we need to do is update each of the different content elements within each of these columns, which I'll do right now. And there we go. We've completely finished and customized our entire About section. The next thing I want to do is duplicate this section in order to continue going down the page. In order to do that, simply click on the section, and then using copy and paste on your keyboard, we can duplicate the section right below. In the Style panel, what we want to do is add an additional class. So over here, we're going to click in the selector, and in this case, add an additional class called Pink. What this will do will allow us to add additional classes without affecting the main section class that we have above. In this case, all I want to do is adjust the background color to be pink. Now I can remove the extra content that we have here that we're not going to use. Similar to what we did with the background section, I want to add an additional class to this heading to make it white. So over here in the Style panel, I'll simply add a class called White and change it so that the font color is white. This is going to be our testimonial section, so I'm going to update the content that we see here. Great. Now below this is going to be a testimonial slider. To add a slider, simply drag in these slider widgets on the left-hand side, and we'll drag it into the container below the heading. The defaulted styles to the slider are going to look like this, but you can change those by simply going to these slider elements that we can see here in the Navigator panel, and then adding a class. In this case, we'll call it our testimonial slider. Now that we've done that, we can adjust the styles, starting with the fill color. The height is defaulted to 300 pixels, which in this case is going to be perfect. Now we can begin to add our content. The first thing I want to do is add in a div block, which is going to hold all of the content within this slider. I'm going to give a class to this div block so that I can further style it. I'm going to call this our testimonial block. And I'm going to adjust the width to be 70% and then center it by using this margin auto button here. Inside of this div block, I'm going to add a testimonial image, testimonial quote, as well as a testimonial title. So in this case, I'm going to start with the image. By dragging in an image element into the slider, I can now begin to style it by first giving it a class. In this case, we can call it our testimonial image. There we go. I want this image to be a fixed width and also be rounded, which you can do by simply going down here and adjusting the border radius. Making the border radius really high will round off until it's a complete circle. Let's go ahead and make that just a little bit bigger. And then I want it to be centered into the page, which we can do two ways. One, by using margin auto here, or by simply adding a center element or center style to the testimonial block that is holding it. The next thing I want to do is add in my testimonial text by adding in a text block here. I'm going to give an additional class to this text block and adjust it accordingly. I want the text to be white, to be slightly bigger, change the font weight, and then also the line height. Below this text, I want to add some text for the testimonial author as well as their title. So what I'm going to do is simply click on the testimonial and then copy and paste it below. I'm going to add an additional class, as I can see now, to push a little bit of spacing on the bottom and a little bit of spacing on the top. Now, because I don't want these to look exactly the same, I'm going to add an additional class. In this case, I'm going to call it author. Now I can adjust the styles without affecting the other. In this case, we'll decrease the size of the text and the line height and change it from white to a dark pink. We can also adjust the weight. Now I can go ahead and start updating this content, starting with the testimonial image. And now I can update the content below. Fantastic. Now that the content is updated, instead of duplicating what we just did, we can simply click on the slide, as we can see here with slide 1, and then using copy and paste on our keyboard, we can duplicate and add more slides. Now, all we would need to do is go in and update the content on each of these different slides to fit all of the different testimonials that we have. Now to move to the next section, which includes our form. So just like we did before, we'll simply copy and paste this section below. Now, instead of having an additional class of pink, I'm going to delete this second class and change it to purple, because in this case, I want the background color to be purple. Now I can delete the extra content here, which in this case is just the slider itself. Now we can adjust the heading text that's left over. Below this heading, I want to add an additional subheading. So in this case, I'll drag in a text block and give it an additional class. Now that I've done that, I can simply center the content, adjust the size, the color, the weight, and the line height. Great, now I can simply update this text now. Below this subheading is where we will add our form. Webflow makes it really easy to add a form by simply dragging in a form element from the left-hand side. Once it's dragged in, the first thing we want to do is add a class to the form wrapper itself, which holds all of the form elements. Once added, we can adjust the width. In this case, I want it to be 60% and center it into the middle of the page. I also want to add some padding above it, some margin above it, to give it a little more space. Webflow will default values for your form for you. In this case, all I need is one email field, so I can delete these extra fields. And just like we've been doing, I want to add a class to this text field to further customize it. In this case, I want to adjust the height to be 50 pixels and the width to be 75%. I also want it to float to the left. Notice that by doing this, we've caused the button to float alongside it. An additional style that I want to add to this text field is to change the border to 3 pixels and pink. Now, just as text links and buttons have hover states, forms have what are called focus states, which again we can access by going to the States dropdown and selecting Focus. Here we can choose to decide what happens to this form field when the user clicks within it. In this case, we want the font color to change to light blue and the border around this field to also change to blue. Now let's go ahead and move to the button before we test this out. So we'll click on the button and we'll give it a class. I'm going to adjust the height to be 50 pixels, just to match the text field. I also want to adjust the width to be 25%. What this is doing is adding a 75% text field to a 25% button, which in this case is going to cover 100% of the wrapper it's in. I also want to change the button background color to be pink. There we go. And just like we've done with previous buttons, we need to add a hover treatment. So clicking on the button and then going to States, we'll select Hover and change the background color to be that light blue. We can also add a transition time by clicking on the button, going down to the bottom. In this case, we'll add background color, and we'll keep the 500 milliseconds change there. And perfect. So let's go ahead and preview this form. Notice now we have the pink outline and the gray text, but if we click with inside it, we get a blue outline and blue text. And with our button, we get a blue hover treatment. Perfect. The last thing we need to add is our footer section. We're going to do the same thing as we've done before by simply clicking on the section, using copy and paste, and then adding or changing the style that is associated to it. In this case, I'm going to delete the purple class and add a class called footer. I'm going to adjust the padding on the top and the bottom because the footer doesn't need nearly as much. Now we can eliminate the elements that we don't need. I also want to adjust the fill color to be a dark gray. There we go. Now for our footer elements. I want to first add a column that's going to separate these into two. On the left-hand side, I want to add a footer logo. So I'll do the same thing. I'm going to add in an image and then upload an adjusted logo. And just like we've done with the nav bar, we can adjust the width to fit our needs. On the right-hand side, I want to add my footer links, which I'll do by simply dragging in a text link. Now I can give it a class and begin to style it. In this case, I want to change the font color to be a light gray. I want to eliminate the underline. I also want it to float to the right. And then using padding, I can adjust it to fit in the middle of the section. Now, just like we've done with our other links, I want to add a hover treatment. So if I go to States, then Hover, we can adjust the font color to move to white upon hover. And again, adding a transition time, we can ease out the different transition. There we go. Now I can simply copy and paste and duplicate these out. Now I can update the content to match the same as we have on the nav bar. And there we go. I've built an entire one-page website in under 30 minutes. Now the next things that we need to do before launching are to add further customizations like interactions, and also make sure that our website looks good on all of our different devices. So let's go ahead and move on to the next level. Before we make our site mobile ready, let's first make sure that all of our links are connected. Let's start with our navbar links that we have up here. In order to access the link settings, simply click on a link, and then on the settings panel on the right-hand side, you'll locate the link settings panel. Here, you'll have 5 options to decide where your links will go. Starting with the direct URL, for example, you could type in www.webflow.com. You could also link to a different page on your site, a section on your page, or an email address and phone number. In this case, because we're working with a one-page website, we're simply just going to link to a section on our page. However, if we look at the list now, we'll notice that there are no sections available. Well, that's because we haven't added any section IDs. In order to add a section ID, simply click on a section. In this case, we'll use the hero section. And then in the settings panel, we have a field for us to insert the section ID. In this case, let's call it hero. Now, if we go back to our link settings, we will see that hero is an option. Now we simply can do the same for the rest of our sections, giving them IDs and then linking them to the navbar. And there we go. Now that we've set up our navbar links, let's now add the same links to our footer. And here we can just use the same exact section destinations for each of these different links. And there we go. Great. Now that we've set up all of our links, let's go ahead and move to the next step, which in this case is going to be adding some animations to the site. If we refresh this page, notice that we have an animation on the hero section, some animations below, as well as if we scroll down, notice the animations disappear and then fade back in. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how we did that. In Webflow, adding in animations and interactions is incredibly easy and fun. Let's go ahead and look on the Interactions panel in the Assets tab. Down here, we have a list of interactions that I've already created, but we can go through them to see how they were done, starting with our load hero. When you're using interactions, there are two steps in order to get started. The first is setting up an initial appearance. The initial appearance is the appearance of the asset or element before any trigger occurs. In this case, what we've chosen for the initial appearance is to move the object to the left 30 pixels and give it a 0% opacity. The next step is to add a trigger. Webflow gives you multiple options to add triggers, including a load trigger, scroll, click, hover, tabs, slider, navbar, and dropdown. In this case, we've used a load trigger, which is just when the page loads. What we've decided is that after the page loads, we wait 200 milliseconds, which we've added simply by adding in 200 to this section down here, and added an additional step to move the object to its original state, and also bring it to 100% opacity. We can preview this by clicking on the button here. Notice that there's a slight delay, and then the object moves to its original state in 100% opacity. If we preview the page, we should see the same result. Perfect. Down below, we also added some additional interactions on a scroll trigger. In this case, we're using what is called a staggered scroll, meaning that these will appear or interact at different times. Let's start with the first block here. I'm going to click on the About block, and then over here I have 3 interactions that I've set up. Let's go ahead and walk through them. The first interaction, notice again we have an initial appearance, scales down to 90% of its original size, in this case 0.9. It also has a 0% opacity. Before, we were looking at a load trigger. In this case, we're using a scroll trigger, which means it occurs as the user scrolls down the page. If we click here, we'll see 2 different versions. Where load only had 1, scroll has into view and scrolling out of view. Scrolling into view occurs when you are scrolling down the page. Scrolling out of view occurs when you are scrolling away from the item. So, when we scroll into view of this item, which in this case we've selected to have 20% from the bottom of the page, we want the item to scale to 100% and then also go back to 100% opacity. We can preview this here. So notice it's just a slight scale and moves to 100% opacity. When we scroll out of view, which again is 20% from the top this time, we want the object to go back to 90% of its original size, but this time just go to 50% opacity, which we can see demoed over here. If we preview this, notice that it scales down to about 90% and a 50% opacity. What we've done with these other 2 is simply duplicate these effects and add a delay. So if we click on Scroll 2, notice the initial appearance is exactly the same. All we've done is added an additional step to the Scroll into View section. In this case, what we've asked it to do is wait 300 milliseconds before it scales to 100% and 100% opacity. For the final step, we've done almost the same thing except increase the wait time to 600 milliseconds from 300 milliseconds. So, as we scroll down the page, each of these objects will come into view 300 milliseconds apart. Let's take a look. Here we have our hero interaction, and as we scroll down the page, notice that we also have our interactions here. And if we scroll down just a little bit, notice that they fade to about 50%, and we scroll back up, they pop in one by one. So that was just a quick example of how you can add interactions to further engage the users on your site. And now, last but not least, we can make our site mobile ready. Webflow makes it incredibly easy to adjust your site and view your site on different devices. Here we can see our site on a tablet, a mobile landscape, and a mobile portrait view. What you might remember with our previous video is that styles will cascade from the original desktop view down all the way to mobile view. However, any styles that we make or any changes that we make to styles on mobile portrait view will not occur on the devices above it. So when working on adjusting for mobile, it's best to start a tablet view. Notice the first thing that we see is that our navbar has now gone to a mobile view. We can edit and change this by simply clicking on any part of the navbar, like the menu button, and in the settings panel, going into the navbar settings. Here you can look at opening the menu, which we can see right there, and adjusting the menu type. In this case, it's dropping down from the top. You can also choose to have it appear from the right or from the left. In this case, we'll choose to have it over from the right. Now we can choose to style and further customize these objects by adding a class. So I'm going to click on the nav menu here, and in the styles panel, add a new class. Now we can change and edit the styles, including the defaulted fill color that we see here of this gray. We can make it to anything that we'd like. How about we try the purple color that we've used on the site? Now we have the option to adjust these nav links for any of our mobile devices, starting with the current. Current means that this is the current link that we are witnessing on the page. Notice, even on desktop, if we scroll down, the links will change to a different color. This is their current state. On mobile, it's exactly the same, so we can customize and design these just the same way. Starting with the top on current, let's choose to change the color to white with a full opacity. For the other links, let's choose to have them as also white, but keep them at a lower opacity. For the hover treatments, we can keep them with the same pink. We can also adjust the padding inside of this nav menu by simply going up and adjusting the padding as you wish. And if we look at our other devices, we'll notice that the nav menu persists all the way down. It keeps the same styles. And now that we've adjusted our nav menu, we can move on to the rest of our site, starting with the hero section. The hero section on tablets still looks well. However, we could still add additional padding if we'd like. In this case, I'm going to add about 30 pixels of padding on both sides. Scrolling down the page, notice that the columns have already been adjusted to fit the width of the current page. We can, however, edit these columns by simply clicking on the column and then going to the settings panel. Here, notice we are given for each device different options for our columns. We can choose currently to have all three showing, or if we'd like, to have them each cover 100% of the site. For tablet, we'll keep it with 3 columns. Down here, notice that these are also being manipulated by the current width of the page. However, the design still looks good, so we're not going to change anything there. For the signups, we can adjust the form to fit maybe a little bit wider on the page. So going back to the form wrapper, which we have already added a class to, we can adjust the width from 60% to a larger width. And again, down here in the footer, it still looks pretty good, so we're going to keep it the same. Let's move on to our landscape view. Notice now that landscape is going to be a little bit more tricky because the page is becoming more and more restricted. So let's go ahead and update the padding so we can keep our text level in the image. And then we can also update the size of our heading so that it fits better in this section. And remember, on the hero subheading, we had a 60% width. Let's go ahead on this view and change it to 100%. Now that we have our text the size that we'd like, we can adjust the padding to center it in the middle of the image. Great. On landscape view, it's going to default going back down on the columns to showing them 100% of the width. However, in this view, you can still show them with 3 columns if you'd like. I think for now, we're going to go ahead and keep to the defaulted landscape view of 100% of the width. The slider section is still looking good, and if we preview this, notice that the mobile slider is still interacting quite well. Our form section may need a little bit of space as we notice that the sides here are getting a little close. So clicking on our main section purple class, we can go ahead and adjust by holding Alt on one side and adjusting the padding on both the left and the right. We are now noticing that our footer is starting to clash as well. We can change this by simply clicking on the column and again going to the settings and choosing whether we'd like to have them side by side or take up 100%. In this case, we want them to take up 100%, and we can further customize them to be centered onto the page. In this case, we don't have any class on either column. We can add that here if we'd like. In this case, let's call it center column. Now we can add a class to center the text in the middle. And if we re-add the same class to this column here, it'll do the exact same thing. We can also adjust the padding to add a little bit more space. There we go. Now we can move on to the final view, our portrait view. And again, we want to make a little bit of adjustments. Up here, we can notice that the image is still a little bit big and is encroaching over here on the menu button. Let's go ahead and give this a class so that we can adjust the width. Here we can adjust the widths so that it can fit alongside of the button, and adjust the padding and the margin in order to center it within the nav bar itself. And again, like we did in the previous sizes, the hero section might need a little bit of realignment so that the text can stay centered in the middle of the image. You can also go through and adjust much of the text, like line height, size, and even color, to best fit the new needs of the site. Again, as we scroll down, these sections are looking good, and our slider here is still looking good. It looks like this might need a little bit of tweaking. Remember before, we had 75% width on the text field, 25% on the submit button. Let's go ahead and change that and just have them at 100%. And let's do the submit button at 50%. And let's center it in the middle of the image. And we can increase the size. Let's have them match. And we can eliminate the margin. And there we go. That feels much better. And down here, again, it looks like these are maybe getting a little bit too tight. You can do things like lower the text size. Whoops, again, that was just editing the current. So in this case, we will lower the text size for all of them so that they will fit all together on the page. All right, this looks good. Let's go ahead and take one final look. And again, you can preview your site on all of your different devices here. This looks great. And there we have it. We have built a full website from start to finish, including links, interactions, and making it mobile ready.